2 million years ago, winter didn't arrive with a forecast. It arrived as an unforgiving force that silenced forests, hardened the ground beneath your feet, and stripped the landscape of the foods your family had depended on for generations. You search for berries, roots, and edible plants, but each day the land offers less than the day before. Hunger isn't an inconvenience. It's a relentless pressure that follows every decision, every step, every sunrise. Surviving another week means finding a solution before nature runs out of chances to give. Not every branch of the human family responded in the same way. Some doubled down on the familiar, consuming greater amounts of tough grasses, roots, and other low-quality plants to endure the changing climate. Others began taking a far riskier path. Instead of relying almost entirely on what grew from the ground, they turned toward the animals sharing their world. A successful hunt could provide dense calories, protein, and nutrients that were becoming increasingly difficult to find elsewhere. Cracking open bones for the rich marrow hidden inside demanded effort and courage, but the reward could sustain an entire group when the landscape could not. It wasn't simply a matter of changing the menu. It was an evolutionary gamble. One strategy slowly disappeared from history, while the other laid the foundation for the species that would eventually spread across every continent on Earth. Yet hunting solved only one problem. Every meal still depended on uncertainty, and every chase carried the risk of failure or death. At some point, our ancestors made a decision even more extraordinary than hunting itself. Instead of pursuing wild animals until they escaped or died, they began keeping them alive. That single shift from predator to caretaker would transform not only our diet, but the future of civilization itself. The question is, how did humanity take that remarkable step, and why did it change the world forever? Keeping an animal alive was a far more complicated challenge than killing one. A successful hunt ended with a meal, but the next hunt always began from scratch. There was no guarantee the herd would return, that the weather would cooperate, or that the hunters themselves would survive the pursuit. Every day reset the struggle. As human populations slowly grew and climates continued to fluctuate, relying entirely on chance became an increasingly dangerous way to live. Imagine discovering that, instead of risking your life every time your family needed food, you could keep some of those animals nearby. They could reproduce, providing a future supply of meat without requiring another exhausting chase across miles of open land. More importantly, they represented something prehistoric humans rarely enjoyed: predictability. For the first time, food could become a resource that was managed rather than merely found. That reliability allowed communities to spend less time desperately searching for their next meal and more time making tools, caring for children, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. But this wasn't simply a change in human behavior. It was the beginning of a remarkable biological partnership. Animals living alongside humans faced a very different set of evolutionary pressures than their wild relatives. Those that were calmer around people were less likely to be killed out of fear. Individuals that tolerated crowded conditions or accepted human presence had more opportunities to reproduce. Generation after generation, these small differences accumulated until entirely new populations emerged, shaped not only by nature, but also by human choices. This process is known as selective breeding. Unlike natural selection, where the environment determines which traits survive, selective breeding allows humans to influence that process by deciding which animals are allowed to reproduce. Over many centuries, this transformed bodies as well as behavior. Domesticated animals often became smaller or more varied in appearance. Their brains tended to shrink slightly compared with their wild ancestors, reflecting reduced survival pressures. Many developed shorter snouts, different coat colors, floppier ears, or a greater willingness to cooperate with humans. These changes appeared so consistently across unrelated species that scientists now refer to many of them collectively as domestication syndrome. Even so, humans could not simply choose any wild creature and expect it to become livestock. Most animals were poor candidates from the very beginning. Some were too aggressive to handle safely. Others panicked in captivity, refused to breed under human care, matured too slowly, or required specialized diets that made them impractical to keep. Despite the millions of animal species that have existed throughout Earth's history, only a tiny fraction possessed the right combination of social behavior, adaptability, and reproductive habits to form lasting partnerships with people. That also explains the difference between taming and domestication. A tamed animal is an individual that has learned to tolerate humans during its lifetime. A domesticated animal belongs to a population that has been genetically shaped over countless generations to live alongside us. One changes through experience, the other changes through evolution. Once people recognized the extraordinary advantages of these partnerships, communities separated by thousands of miles began arriving at the same idea independently. Yet the animals they domesticated depended entirely on the landscapes they called home. The earliest domesticated animals were not chosen because they were the biggest or the strongest. They were chosen because they fit naturally into human lives. Long before cities, kingdoms, or written history, people living across the Fertile Crescent began forming partnerships with animals that could thrive on landscapes humans could not fully exploit themselves. Rocky hillsides, dry grasslands, and sparse vegetation held little value for people alone. But for grazing animals, they were an endless buffet waiting to be transformed into food. Among the first to make that transition were sheep and goats. Wild sheep, descended from agile mouflons that roamed the mountains stretching from Anatolia through the Caucasus and into Western Asia, possessed one invaluable trait. They lived in tightly organized flocks. Once a few animals accepted human guidance, the rest naturally followed. Goats whose ancestors were the sure-footed Bezoar ibex of the Zagros Mountains proved equally adaptable. They could survive on shrubs, thorny plants, and vegetation that many other animals ignored, making them remarkably resilient companions for early farming communities. These animals offered far more than meat alone. Their milk provided nourishment without requiring slaughter. Their wool and hair became clothing and shelter. Their hides were turned into containers, ropes, and tools. Even their manure enriched fields or served as fuel where wood was scarce. Every part of the animal could be used, allowing people to extract value from the same herd year after year. Instead of consuming a single meal, humans had discovered a renewable resource. As settlements expanded, another far more imposing creature entered the picture. Towering over modern cattle was the aurochs, a massive wild bovine that once roamed from Western Europe across the grasslands of Asia. Adult bulls could stand nearly 2 meters tall at the shoulder, carrying enormous forward-curving horns that made them among the most formidable herbivores of their time. Cave artists painted them repeatedly, suggesting they commanded both fear and admiration. Despite their intimidating appearance, a small number of these giants eventually became the ancestors of billions of cattle alive today. Genetic studies suggest that domesticated tauran cattle may trace their origins to surprisingly few individuals managed by early communities in what is now southeastern Turkey around 10,500 years ago. A separate domestication event later occurred in the Indus Valley, producing the humped zebu cattle that remain common across South Asia and tropical regions today. Although these two lineages adapted to different climates, they shared the same revolutionary role. They converted grass, something humans cannot digest, into meat, milk, leather, and eventually muscular labor capable of pulling plows and transporting heavy loads. Not every successful domesticate grazed peacefully across open fields. Some preferred the forests. Wild boars, the ancestors of modern pigs, possessed an entirely different survival strategy. Highly intelligent, endlessly curious, and willing to eat almost anything, they thrived wherever humans left scraps behind. Rather than requiring carefully maintained pasture, pigs could consume roots, fallen fruit, nuts, insects, and discarded food, efficiently converting waste into valuable protein. Their rapid reproduction made them especially attractive. A single sow could produce large litters, allowing herds to expand far faster than cattle or sheep. For growing villages, that meant a dependable supply of meat that replenished itself with remarkable speed. By now, the pattern seems obvious. Humans selected animals that were useful, adaptable, and capable of living alongside them. Yet the most familiar domesticated animal today followed a path unlike any of the others. The ancestor of every modern chicken was a colorful forest bird known as the red jungle fowl, native to tropical regions stretching from northeastern India through Southeast Asia and into southern China. At first glance, it hardly resembles an animal destined to become the world's most abundant bird. It spent its days scratching through leaf litter in search of seeds, insects, and fallen fruit, rarely venturing far from dense vegetation. Archaeological evidence indicates that people began domesticating these birds roughly 7,400 years ago in northern China before they spread across Asia and eventually into Europe and the Middle East. But here's the remarkable part. For thousands of years, chickens were not primarily raised for food. Instead, prized roosters were bred for cockfighting. Across many cultures, these contests became spectacles of entertainment, competition, and gambling. The birds traveled enormous distances across continents, not because people wanted chicken dinners, but because they admired their aggression and resilience. Only much later did communities begin raising chickens systematically for eggs and meat. Archaeological discoveries from the ancient city of Maresha in present-day Israel reveal large numbers of butchered chicken bones dating to around 2,300 years ago, providing some of the earliest clear evidence that chickens had become an important food source. Once people recognized how efficiently these birds reproduced, matured, and converted scraps into protein, their global expansion became unstoppable. Today, there are roughly 2.5 chickens for every human on Earth, making them the most numerous bird the planet has ever known. A species once valued for sport ultimately became one of humanity's most important sources of food. A reminder that domestication rarely follows the path we might expect. Yet, feeding people was only the beginning. As civilizations grew larger and more connected, humans began asking whether animals could provide something even more valuable than food alone. As villages grew into towns and towns into civilizations, humans realized that animals could offer something just as valuable as food: energy. Long before engines, roads, or railways, every heavy load had to be carried by muscle. At first, those muscles belonged to people. But once humans learned to harness the strength of other species, entire societies gained the ability to move farther, trade faster, and build on a scale that had never been possible before. Perhaps no animal symbolizes that transformation more than the horse. Descended from wild herds that roamed the vast Eurasian steppe stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan, horses evolved in open grasslands where speed meant survival. Their long legs, powerful lungs, and remarkable endurance made them perfectly suited to crossing enormous distances. Around 6,000 years ago, people living on these windswept plains began domesticating them, likely first for meat and milk before recognizing something far more extraordinary. A horse could carry a rider farther in a single day than a person could walk in several. It could pull carts loaded with supplies, connect distant communities, and eventually carry soldiers into battle. Entire empires, from the Mongols to countless kingdoms before and after them, depended on the mobility horses provided. Geography had shaped the perfect runner, and humanity transformed it into history's greatest vehicle. Not every landscape favored speed across endless plains. South of the Mediterranean and along the dry valleys of northeastern Africa, another animal evolved for endurance, rather than sprinting. The donkey descended from the African wild ass, a species adapted to rocky terrain, intense heat, and scarce water. These harsh environments produced an animal capable of carrying heavy burdens across landscapes where wheeled vehicles were often useless. Domesticated thousands of years ago in northeastern Africa, donkeys became indispensable to traders, farmers, and travelers. They quietly connected villages, transported harvests, and supplied communities long before grand trade networks appeared on maps. Though often overshadowed by horses, civilizations could scarcely have functioned without them. Move farther into the deserts of Arabia and Central Asia, and even donkeys begin to struggle. Here, evolution produced one of nature's most specialized survivors, the camel. Its broad feet prevented it from sinking into sand, while its extraordinary ability to conserve water allowed it to cross landscapes that seemed almost impossible to inhabit. The single-humped dromedary became the lifeline of Arabian deserts, while the shaggy two-humped Bactrian camel evolved across the cold, arid steppes of Central Asia. These regional differences determined their roles. Dromedaries connected oasis towns across scorching deserts, while Bactrian camels carried silk, spices, precious metals, and ideas along the Silk Road. Without camels, many of history's greatest overland trade routes would have been impossible, leaving entire civilizations isolated from one another. Across the Atlantic, people faced a different challenge altogether. The towering Andes Mountains offered no horses, cattle, or camels. Instead, the ancestors of Andean civilizations turned to their own native camelids. Llamas, larger and strong enough to carry moderate loads, became the freight animals of mountain trails where wheels offered little advantage. Their smaller relatives, alpacas, were less suited to transport but produced exceptionally soft wool that protected people against freezing high-altitude climates. These animals allowed goods, textiles, and food to move between isolated mountain communities, helping sustain complex societies in one of the world's most demanding environments. Farther north, on the Tibetan Plateau, another specialist emerged. Yaks evolved where thin air, freezing temperatures, and rugged terrain defeated most other large mammals. Their dense coats insulated them against brutal winters, while their powerful bodies carried supplies across mountain passes that remained inaccessible for much of the year. They provided milk, meat, fiber, hides, and transportation, making permanent life at extreme elevations possible. In many ways, yaks became the foundation upon which Himalayan cultures were built, just as camels supported desert civilizations and horses transformed the open steppe. Each of these partnerships reflected the same remarkable pattern. Humans did not reshape geography to fit their needs. They found animals already perfectly adapted to local environments and built civilizations around their strengths. The species differed, but the principle remained the same wherever people settled. By this point, it might seem as though the story of domestication belongs entirely to large animals, but some of the partnerships that reshaped human civilization came from creatures small enough to fit in the palm of your hand. Their value wasn't measured in muscle or meat, it was measured in commerce, agriculture, and the ability to connect distant civilizations. The silkworm is perhaps the most remarkable example. Domesticated in China around 5,000 years ago, it transformed a simple caterpillar into the foundation of one of history's most valuable industries. As the larvae spun delicate cocoons from a single continuous silk thread, people learned to unwind and weave those fibers into a fabric unlike anything else in the ancient world. Silk became a luxury so prized that merchants carried it thousands of miles across Asia and into Europe, giving its name to the legendary Silk Road. Along those trade routes traveled not only cloth, but also ideas, religions, technologies, and entire cultures. One tiny insect helped weave together civilizations separated by continents. Equally influential were honeybees. Although people had collected wild honey for thousands of years, organized beekeeping emerged in ancient Egypt, where humans learned to manage colonies instead of simply raiding them. Honey provided one of the few reliable natural sweeteners available before modern agriculture, while beeswax became essential for candles, medicines, waterproofing, and craftsmanship. Yet their greatest contribution was one early societies could scarcely see. As bees moved from flower to flower collecting nectar, they carried pollen with them, allowing countless crops to reproduce. Entire harvests quietly depended on their daily work. It's easy to overlook these miniature partners because they never pulled wagons or carried armies. Yet without silkworms, global trade would have developed very differently, and without honeybees, agriculture itself would have been far less productive. Sometimes the smallest domesticated animals leave the largest footprints on human history. Looking back across every animal we've explored, a remarkable pattern begins to emerge. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs all appeared within or near the Fertile Crescent. Horses came from the vast Eurasian grasslands. Camels evolved in deserts. Llamas and alpacas belonged to the Andes, while yaks conquered the Tibetan Plateau. This wasn't a coincidence. Humans didn't simply choose where to domesticate animals. Geography chose for them. The Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, offered an unusually rich combination of climates, wild grasses, fresh water, and, perhaps most importantly, an abundance of large mammals already predisposed to living in herds. These environments repeatedly brought humans into contact with species that possessed the right biological traits for domestication. Surprisingly, those traits are incredibly rare. Successful domesticated animals tend to share a similar evolutionary toolkit. They mature relatively quickly, breed reliably in captivity, tolerate living close to one another, consume readily available food, and naturally follow social hierarchies that humans can step into as leaders. Species lacking even one or two of these characteristics often resist domestication entirely. That's why, despite countless attempts throughout history, zebras never replaced horses. Their unpredictable temperament and powerful fight-or-flight instincts make them exceptionally difficult to manage. Deer panic easily in enclosed spaces, while moose are solitary, highly territorial, and require enormous amounts of food. Countless other species may seem useful at first glance, but evolution shaped them for survival in ways that make partnership with humans almost impossible. The greatest insight is that domestication was never simply about human intelligence or determination. It depended just as much on millions of years of evolution producing a handful of animals whose behavior happened to align with our own needs. Civilization was built not only by the choices our ancestors made, but by the rare species that were capable of choosing, in their own evolutionary way, to live alongside us. Now, imagine returning to that frozen landscape from the beginning of our story. Food is still scarce. The winters are still unforgiving. Wild animals are still dangerous. But this time, instead of chasing every meal across the horizon, some of those animals are waiting nearby. They reproduce, provide food season after season, and gradually become woven into everyday life. What began as a strategy for surviving another winter became one of the greatest turning points in human history. From that moment onward, civilization accelerated. Reliable livestock supported growing populations, making permanent agriculture possible. Stable food supplies allowed villages to expand into towns and towns into cities. Animals pulled plows through fields, carried merchants across continents, and connected distant cultures through trade routes that exchanged not only goods, but ideas, technologies, and beliefs. Even today, they remain at the heart of the global economy, shaping everything from the food on our tables to the industries that sustain billions of people. It's easy to think of domestication as something humans did to animals, but the story is far more remarkable than that. Over thousands of years, both sides changed. We shaped their evolution through selective breeding, while they transformed the course of ours. Every farm, every supermarket, and every meal we eat today can be traced back to a handful of wild species that gradually learned to live alongside us. In many ways, civilization wasn't built by humans alone. It was built through partnerships with other species that forever changed the destiny of life on Earth.